Pop down to your local fish and chip shop and chances are you're not going to be ordering the likes of one of these. But there are fishermen who are catching so-called deep-sea fish. Now the EU is considering a new law to regulate the industry. The question is, what should it contain? Two people with very different points of view join me now. Barry Dees from the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations and Claire Nouvin from the environmental group Bloom. I hope I pronounced your name right there, Claire, more or less. I'd like to start with you. If you could just explain, before we get into the pros and cons, what is deep sea fishing?
Well, in a nutshell, it's because we've overfished, in the 1980s, we've overfished the accessible fish stocks. We went deeper and deeper to look for new fish, fish resources. And so we went down to areas which were almost 2,000 meters of depth. And we've targeted fish such as orange roughy that was actually quite tasty. So we've remembered that one quite well. And in 2010, we've closed the orange roughy fishery. So now it's more black scabbard fish and round-nosed grenadier type of fish, blueling also.
I mean, these are probably fish that ordinary people have probably not heard of, people that go to their, as I mentioned, their fish and chip shop. Why, Barry, is it necessary to go after these fish? Are they valuable for you as an industry?
Oh, absolutely. These are high-value, high-quality fish for which there's a demand. And I don't think it's quite true to say that the exploration of deep water fisheries was just a response to pressure on other stocks. I think that's part of the picture, a little bit more complicated than that. Most of the fishing for deep water species takes place on the continental slope, so we're already fishing on the top. It's actually the slope area in the European context. And there's a significant number of international fleets fish for these stocks. And
what kind of fish, what happens to this fish? Is this the kind of fish that we see on our plates? We just are not kind of commonly aware, commonly know about the names?
If you go into restaurants in Brussels, you will find black scabbard fish, highly valued, very, very nice fish.
When it comes down to it, what are your concerns about this type of fishing?
Well, actually, Barry looks like a very nice person, but we are going to disagree on a certain amount of things, it seems. I don't tend to think that they're very good fish, and they're not very high value. They're only 1% of the catch overall, for example, in France, and in the EU, it's just about more than 1%. So you're going to have
worth more than 100 million euros nonetheless. It might be only a small proportion.
1% of the catch is really, really tiny. That means that as a consumer, you're not going to find them that easily. In France, it takes quite some effort to actually look for the fish in the supermarkets. You'll only find them in the supermarkets. In France, you won't find them on the menu in a restaurant.
Let's be clear, what are your concerns, though, about this type of fishing?
And so the concerns are that there's certain ways you can catch those fish. One of those ways is called a mixed fishery. It's a bottom trawl fishery. It's a big net. It's weighted, so you've got weights which actually you can drag it on the seafloor. So of course, it's not rocket science to understand that if you drag a big net on the seafloor, it's going to do some damage. And yes, you can have some damage. Maybe some level of damage is acceptable if you want to go and catch food, and why not? The problem is that the deep sea is a really different environment. It's basically in the slow lane. And these animals, most of them, live longer than our grandmothers, basically. So we really have to catch them and to go about actually exploiting these areas with a lot of caution.
Would you accept that there are some serious environmental concerns because of this style of fishing that happens in the deep sea?
Yes, I don't think we're going to find much to disagree on in terms of the objectives here. We're talking about slow-growing species that need special protection, that need a very low level of exploitation. And we're also talking in the context of marine ecosystems in which there are very vulnerable habitats. So I think an especially careful approach is absolutely appropriate in these fisheries.
And given what you're saying, we have already had European Commission proposals. The discussions are now underway in the European Parliament. They're calling for a very safe approach, aren't they? More safeguards. What do you make of what's been suggested?
I think really with this proposal, the Commission have harked back to the old way of doing things, a blanket approach. And with blanket approaches, you tend to get a lot of unintended consequences. There are a number of tools available, the quotas, protecting marine areas in terms of closure of those areas, selectivity. There's a number of different approaches that can be applied. Our problem with the proposal is the prohibition, what would amount to a prohibition on deep water trawling and on deep water gill nets. That's the issue.
The thing with bottom trawling is that in the deep sea, because the deep sea is so fragile, it's been recognized as really just not the way forward, and there's overwhelming, scientific evidence that it just doesn't fly with the deep sea environment.
Claire says that there's plenty of scientific data that overwhelmingly suggests that there's a need for better environmental protection.
Well, that's not what the scientists say. That, many of these fisheries are data deficient, and I think part of the approach that we would be advocating is developing a collaborative approach in which our informed understanding of these fisheries are built and the targeted management measures are based on that. There are alternatives. There are alternatives throughout the world based on best practice that we can use here. It's just the ban. A blanket ban is just over the top.
Just briefly from each of you then, as things stand, what do you make of the EU proposals? Where would you like them to be improved before we come to a final vote? First of you, Claire.
Well, the thing is, I have a hard time disconnecting the economic performance of these fisheries, from the ecological issues, which are, really just, as you said, not debated anymore. And the problem is that we've looked at the French case, because that's the one we know best, and the French big trawlers, the one that operate in Scottish waters and UK waters, are the ones that are going to be most affected by the European Commission proposal. And it turns out that these very few vessels are actually totally underperforming. I mean, they are chronically loss-making and they're subsidized. And so that's where I really have a hard time. I'm like, why should we be funding the destruction of the most vulnerable marine habitats if it doesn't create value for the economy, but it's a drain on society?
Just if you can react to that?
I'm not arguing in favour of subsidies. Subsidies are on their way out.
But is this a loss-making industry anyway for the likes of Scottish trawlers that are going after this kind of fish?
What's the problem then? Because if they can't make money, they're not going to be there. It's a commercial fishery, and that just stands to reason. No, the issue is deeper than that. It's about using a very heavy-handed approach to crack a nut when there are viable alternatives available. And I'm sure as this process moves forward and member states come in and have their say, that a compromise will be reached. But I think it'll be quite different. The outcome will be quite different from the proposal.
Well, there's going to be arguments still to come, but we're going to have to leave it there. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining me.